the theme of this conference has really been the idea of how do we chart the path for Africa? And one of the places in the field that has been quite changing rapidly has been the field of AI. In the past few months and years, we've experienced quite rapid progress and large language models being deployed. GPT-4o was recently released, and every single week there's something new that comes up. But amidst all this conversation, we need to ask ourselves, what does AI mean for a continent? Away from the hype, away from the idea of data as the new oil, and all this lingos that people throw around, what does this mean for a continent? And for us to have that conversation, we have an amazing panel proudly sponsored by Econet. You can quickly check the booth outside. But just to jump into what the objectives of the panel today, we want to talk about ideas around data sovereignty. What does it mean for a continent to have 80% of its data being held by Western-based companies? We want to talk about AI and African labor. What does it mean when Kenyan content moderators are paid $2 an hour to moderate content that the Western people consume? We want to talk about what does AI and democracy mean for us? And to have this conversation, we'll have an amazing panel. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Mr. Roy Chimanikire, the Deputy CEO of Econet Wireless Zimbabwe. Kindly let's welcome him to the stage and appreciate him with a round of applause. Thank you very much. The second speaker I would like to introduce is the head of public policy, Meta, also an Oxford alumni. Let's kindly put your hands together for Ida in the eye. The third speaker I'd like to introduce is Mr. Osmo Wood, the advisor of Digital Innovation, Commonwealth Secretary, United Kingdom. And ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Mr. Chukudum Chukwedo, his account manager of data and AI Intelligent Consulting Hub, Accenture UK. Kindly let's give him a round of applause. Perfect. So just a bit of ground rules. We'll be having this conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll head on to the audience to try and grab your questions. There'll be Slido that will be running on the stage, so please drop your questions there. But hopefully, if time allows, we'd like to get some audience engagement, so I will spare some time to be able to hear from the audience. So yeah, let's quickly jump into the conversation, and I will switch for a minute. Yeah, here we go. Perfect. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming to the panel today and gracing us with your presence. And I think generally the first interesting question that I'd like us to start with is, away from the AI hype that we're seeing that's currently happening, what are the different areas you think AI is particularly transforming, or you're excited could transform the continent, be it in government, public care, or public healthcare, or transport? Are there any particular areas that you're quite passionate that you think AI could potentially transform? We can start with Roy here as we go to the rest of the panel. Yeah.
Jabez, thank you very much. I think, your question is very apt in the sense that when you look at AI and its ability to transform so many sectors of our society, it has the ability to change the way we look at life itself. And I use that analogy because it's not a technology like, for example, mobile telephony, which is a communications technology. This is a technology that's being applied to change the way we do things quite fundamentally. I know my group chairman referred to it as similar to when the internet first started. And if you can imagine the transformative impact that the internet has had on all our lives, but not only as a platform for communication, but a platform for almost every other industry. And if you look at the developments that have taken place since the advent of the internet, we have seen, from AI itself, which is really a continuum from being able to send an SMS, which is, where telephony started on, and where when you look at the internet, when we started sending emails, we're now looking at a technology that has the ability to transform health, education, transport, you name it, every single thing. So if you ask, what am I most excited about in terms of what it can do? I think it's really the ability that we are no longer limited physically by our thinking and our natural state to be able to re-engineer the way we look at problems and the speed and efficiency in which we will do it. So I'm not excited about a particular area. I'm excited about the full transformative impact that it has on all aspects of our lives, basically.
Thank you so much for that response. Just moving on, Ida, your thoughts?
Um, Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you for having me. Look, I echo a lot what you said, Roy, around just the transformative potential of AI, although we're a long way to go, right? I think amongst the hype, it's also important just to be grounded in reality that a lot of these language models are still quite basic, to be honest. But I do think in an area that's really close to my heart, we're seeing a lot of great progress, and I want to think about here public health. And what comes to mind for me is companies like Zipline who are actually using AI and drones to be able to deliver vaccine, critical medical supplies in very remote and rural areas. As a Senegalese, when I first came to the UK, I know there's a lot of things folks say about the NHS, but as a poor student, when I got treated for free, I was very grateful, right? So I do think there's something around looking at technology. You know, when you think of AI, we think of AGI and all the big stuff it can do, but also looking at technology and thinking about how something like AI can transform something so fundamental and critical to the development of the continent, such as healthcare. I mentioned Zipline, but I know there are tons of other startups also experimenting new ways of looking at telemedicine or leveraging AI bots and chatbots to be able to really deliver community care in parts of the continent that are the most marginalized.
Great. Thank you for that. Osmo, any particular areas you're quite excited about AI in Africa?
Well, to be honest, there are quite a few things, but I would step back a bit and say I think it's about the transformative ability of giving people opportunities again in terms of literacy, basic digital literacy. We speak about the 21st century being the year, or the century of Africa, and I do think, I think it was mentioned earlier, quite respectfully, it was said that there's no wealth in Africa. I think is the opposite. Africa has the most wealth in the world and always has. And I think herein lies an opportunity for us again in the wider world to look again to Africa and to give a chance to really correct some things that may have been done wrong in the past, but also provide a link to bridge that proverbial digital divide. And that's what encapsulates the transformative, I think, potential of AI. I love the idea of products and models and these things, but deeper, I like the idea of, you know, giving people, young women and girls, the opportunity to get back into a new mainstream world that the leaders of this world still haven't quite defined. And I think this is a once in a generational, perhaps a millennial opportunity we have in front of us.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Echoing what everyone has said, AI is going to be transformative. And I look at it this way with AI in Africa, like as it's getting the trend with large language models and all, it's it's bringing a paradigm shift where what used to take a year, 2 years to solve, we're going to have situations where business solutions will be done. Those same things will be done in 1 month and with less technical skill sets as would have been required. And also, we're in this in the information age. We hear data is the new oil, and data, we release data every single second. So the way I look at it from I used to have a mining background. If data is the new oil, AI is going to be the refined perfumes, the candles and all. And that's what we're going to see cut across healthcare, precision agriculture, amongst others.
Thank you very much. Just to pick up on what you said, you've said the term that data is a new oil, and there have been concerns that this problematic framing of data allows extractive Western-based companies to come and literally drawing paradigms from the mining companies. We've seen companies coming and extracting data in quite heinous ways. And using this data from the African continent. And just to start up with you, Roy, we've seen quite extractive data collection practices. If you think about fintech within the continent, where Western-based companies just come and extract this data, yet we don't get the value. Coming from Zimbabwe, where there's you've had quite a lot of experience in the mining industry, do you draw any parallels between the data collection practices, and do you find the framing of data as a new oil quite problematic for the African continent?
Chebes, thank you for that question. And as I reflected on it, you are right. It presents a problematic framing in itself, because when you look at Africa, the way we are positioned and the way this AI revolution is taking place, it's a very much a very knowledge-based and research-based kind of field where the innovation requires a lot of research for it to happen. So when I've looked at Africa, for instance, and you look at statistics like how much is actually being invested in Africa for startups, for innovation, and you compare to what the big tech is doing, we are nowhere near the level of scale that they're doing this at. So when it then comes to these large models, and one of the things you shared with us was the ability to create the computational capacity for these models to operate. And it requires technology which is resident in the West, chipsets, advanced chipsets. It requires us to have these large data center infrastructure, which when you look at what Africa has in terms of that infrastructure, it's nowhere near what you're seeing in China and the West. So when it comes to the data that is being processed, there is a risk that what we will become as Africa is basically, like what has happened with extractive industries. We will just become the producers of the information that big tech will use to develop products which they will sell, which they will sell to us. So it is a problematic framing, and it is problematic in the sense that we will become the consumers and we will not benefit economically from the data that we are producing and the kind of products and services that we are going to get. And to give you a good example, WhatsApp, for example, it is a lot of data that we produce through it, but I don't believe that we will benefit from it in Africa in the current framing that we have. But I also do not blame big data, the big companies for it. I think it takes us as the people who are in the conversation in the room to define our own space and to define the space in which we will play in. So even though it is problematic, we mustn't be complaining about it. We must find a way to create our own space to play within this area and to make ourselves relevant to the conversation.
Sure. Thank you for that response. Just building on that, Ida, you're a representative here. You're working in big tech, so we must ask the controversial questions. Does it bother you the fact that a huge proportion of the African data set is not owned by African-based companies, and it's a Western-based, for example, Silicon Valley, I'm not mentioning names, but a Silicon Valley company, for example, that collects this data, stores this data, and they have access to all this data and they can get all the value from this data for themselves. Does it bother you in any way? Do you find any of that being problematic?
Well, I find the data is the new oil framing actually problematic, but for a different reason, in that data is not oil, right? Data is not finite, right? If you have a specific amount of oil, you use it, I can't use it, right? Whereas data is not the same, right? If Facebook or Google use your data, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it again or someone else cannot use it. So I do think that a framing of data is a new oil, and I understand why it exists, is a bit of a misnomer and a zero-sum game, right? That actually doesn't really exist. Look, I mean, I think it's important to take a step back around the data sovereignty conversation, especially as it relates to the African continent. I mean, it's true that the biggest drivers of tech at the moment are big American companies and big Western companies. They invest the most, they have the most resources. And even frankly, when we talk about the AI conversation and you talked about, computational power, GPUs and all that, it's the big tech companies who are investing in that. Like, just to give you guys a sense of scale, Meta announced that this year we'll be investing between 35 and 40 billion on just AI infrastructure. Google invested something around 35 billion, Apple 24 billion. That's like twice the GDP of Senegal, where I'm from, right? And and also twice the GDP of many other smaller African countries. So I think we have to really position ourselves into a world that our data, true, is going to be used by these big companies, right? But also at the same time, what do we get out of it, right? And I do think that's where the conversation has really been around how do we blame big tech, but also we haven't looked into ourselves and say, what do our governments, us as African, can do to make sure that this is a win-win situation? How do we create regulation frameworks, right, around data portability, which the EU has done, right? Where if you're using your data on Facebook or you have your data on Google, you can also take it out, and a local startup could use that same data that has been used to develop their own solution. So I do think, and I understand it from the history of the African continent, of the history of exploitation, colonialism, we need to understand that there is a power imbalance. But again, the only way for us to win in this situation is to start into the conversation of how do we work together? How do we collaborate? What do I get out of it? I know you need me, right? Because you are here, and a lot of your users are based, and I am the future, right? For a lot of these big companies, they look at the African continent as being the future base of their users. How do we make sure that I also get something out of it? And I think for me, sitting in a lot of conversation with African governments, that kind of framing is missing.
Great. I really appreciate your comments on that. Just building on that, Osmal, I'd like to drive the conversation further. Ida mentions the idea of setting up regulatory frameworks or policy that allow us to breach the gap that exists in the current information asymmetry, where Western-based companies are the ones that control most of our data. What do you think are quite actionable policies that African governments should think about? You've done quite a lot of work in building infrastructure in grassroots level. Do you have any examples of policies that could protect communities and societies that produce data to be able to benefit from the technologies built on the data they produce?
I think, not to put in words, a meta part of this, the argument is the purpose of policies. Policies are supposed to, and to a means to an end, as per the context of the environment. Now, the policy situation in Africa more or less has been inherited from colonial masters and other external actors. So I think first and foremost, when going back to what I said initially about the opportunity that AI brings, herein lies a new opportunity for us to define the policy space in Africa or within specific countries and communities and tribal groupings, or however it goes in Africa as per the context of the country, of the situation, of the environment. I think that part in policy is more or less still missing if you take it outside of the AI digital space. Again, because of age-old mental constructs or approaches. Again, here we have an opportunity to put that aside and think, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is a policy framework, if any, needed? Basically, the set of practices that we have to execute. How does this apply to our context? If we look external to our neighbor, potentially we're looking at it from a perspective of inspiration, but not to be dictated how to get it done. I think now, specifically the question of data is a new oil. One of the key advantages I'm thinking of in terms of tactical steps is just a general standard approach to managing data in Africa is missing. And right now, the Commonwealth is doing some really good work in simply agricultural data across the continent and in the wider Commonwealth, but we have a vested interest in particularly standing up something Malawi and Ghana. I am heartened and fascinated at the same time, a bit dismayed to realize that in countries where we think that there's a lot happening, but people or actors within that same country don't even know what their person in their own government ministry in a different domain is doing. This is how we have the conversation started. We speak to the specific challenges that we are looking in that little smidgen of area. How can it overflow and within the remit of what we're trying to solve? I think not the other way around, and I think that's a good step to take an advantage of this.
Sure. Thank you quite for those key pointers. Just driving this conversation further, there's this idea that I was reading this article where someone said it takes a village to raise a chatbot, and I was just pondering about that idea, thinking about AI and African labor. So we acknowledge that a lot of African labor has been used to filter out harmful content, that then these models are then fine-tuned on, or reinforcement learning with human feedback, which you've worked on. What are your thoughts on big companies outsourcing this ugly work, for lack of a better word, to the global south? Is it in a way of, someone pointed it out as exporting trauma in a way? And just to give you an example, this work is, for example, in Kenya, getting paid as simple as low as $1.5 per hour. What are your general thoughts in like how current model development is happening with regards to Africa playing the bottom tier role in doing the hard and dirty work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way I would look at that is, first, we need to go beyond having each African country with their individual data protection acts and data privacy regulations and begin to look at more supranational approaches, regional approaches that can be enforced. The reason you have the EU GDPR having the force of law behind it is because it's an entire bloc. And if you have countries trying to negotiate with an individual EU country, it won't be as strong as you're trying to negotiate with the entire EU bloc. So say we have something like that equivalent for the African Union on data privacy protections, on international, like harmonizing Africa's specific requirements with International Labour Organization expectations, then we can hold these organizations accountable. We can demand that if they are going to be holding operations within any country in Africa, that they are ensuring that what their work process is in line with what is expected from ILO. Then also would expect that they also give like routine reports and they give confirmation that whatever they are paying their workforce is at the minimum going to be above whatever is considered the minimum requirement, like cost of living. So if we're able to do that and keeping them accountable with ILO requirements, and they know that they will, if they don't meet these things, they could be reported to their home countries. There would be that pressure and push for them to, because they wouldn't do same things in like the EU or any other places because they have strong civil societies that keep them accountable. So we need to keep encouraging our civil societies to keep doing what they need to do. Government needs to keep enacting these policies, and we need to begin to consider a supranational approach beyond just individual countries in Africa.
Thank you for that feedback and just sharing on the idea of trying to get a transnational body movement that works in line with the ILO. I'm quite interested, Ida, to get your views. I'll just give you some context. Meta was recently in a case where it outsourced some of its content moderation to Sama, and Sama, some of its employers, there's currently a court case that's happening where they are suing Meta for the working conditions, where some of these workers state that they can't have good nights, they're going through traumatic moments because they were subjected to going through large content to moderate, mostly content that is produced in the West. From a platform perspective, talk us through the idea of why would we need to export content moderation to the African continent, pay them cheaper than what we would pay content moderation within Europe, for example? And is that fair? Is that justifiable?
I'll give you the business answer and the African answer to start with. And just to be clear as well, I can't comment on an ongoing legal case. But just to give context, right, from a meta perspective around content moderation, I'm sure many of you are either on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and you've maybe seen, especially during elections, really heinous content that was written in your local language. You reported it, and nothing happened. And the reason why nothing happened is because our AI tools, we call them classifiers, weren't able to detect that this was actually hate content, because hate content is forbidden on Meta's platform. A usual process is that if you see something that's heinous, actually, even before you see it, our AI algorithm should be good enough to detect it. And 95% of the cases, they can do it in English language content, but when it's for a more local languages, they can't. And in African, and in Africa, I worked on a couple of elections. I can think of Cameroon, I can think of DRC, where the content issue was quite huge, right? Because we didn't have enough language support on Lingala, for instance, and some of the more smaller languages. And we know the continent has almost like 1,000+ language. And so the idea behind actually having content moderators across the continent came from that, right? We needed more support to label content in our local language so that the platforms will be able to serve Africans better. These labelers, as we call them, don't only sit in Africa, they actually sit in Dublin as well, and actually in other parts of the world, like in Eastern European countries as well, where we face the same problem. So this is just to say, Meta doesn't have content laborers in Kenya versus the UK out of evilness, right? It was because it was trying to solve a clear business problem and trying also from advocacy actually of many people, civil society organization, government, people internally, to make sure that we had support that these our AI tools would take into account African content. So that's the business answer, and that's why it's necessary to have it. I think there's also the African answer around the fact that, and that's exactly what you were saying, is that we just have very weak labor laws in the continent, right? Usually, when someone set up something like a content moderator, moderating organization, there are rules that you need to follow because yes, it's very gruesome, but it's important, right? If you're not seeing that content and if no one is labeling, no one would know that it's gruesome. So usually the process for a lot of the content, the folks that do content moderation is that you do get some psychological counseling afterwards because the content can be quite difficult to deal with. And we've seen, and I know it's not a meta-unique problem, that in many other parts that some of those due processes weren't respected. And I do think ultimately the problem we face in tech is not unique to other sectors, right? That we really can't argue ourselves out of weak institutions, right? And out of weak laws. And if we ourselves don't respect those labor laws, then it's very easy for it to be taken advantage, because the business at the end of the day will always look at what's my bottom line, what's the most efficient way to do so. So I think the cases we've seen and the media uproar is actually a positive direction, because it's raising the alarm to say, look, we are not accepting this, right? And we have to have a certain minimal standard of ethics. But I do think we have this bargaining problem where it's not only Kenya that needs to do it, it's the whole of the continent that really needs to do it. And even I would say the whole global south, right? So that we can have common rules. Because if you do it in if Kenya says no, but Senegal says yes, Liberia says no, on Mali says yes, it doesn't quite work, right? So I do think again, and it's not to put the ball into the camp of government or countries again, but I do think there's a lot of work civil society can do to really start thinking through not national lenses, but especially in the case of the internet, really thinking through solidarity across regions, right? Whether it's at the continental level or at the global south level, because that's the only way our voices will truly be heard and what we say really matter.
Sure. Thank you for that quite robust response. And you bring the idea, you give examples of elections, and since you've brought it up, I think it's quite good if we move the conversation there. With this new AI tools we're seeing, it's quite accessible for people to create disinformation, to create hate speech, to create deepfakes, for example. You can easily go to GPT or any large language model, ask it to write for you quite convincing content. And Roy, you've worked quite a lot in regulation. And my question to you would be, we've seen social media companies being quite complacent in dealing with African election in comparison to the Western context. So I'll give you the example of during the Capitol in the US when there was the attack on the Capitol. Twitter, for example, had the break glass where they downranked content from specific places. In Germany, for example, we have the NetzDG where social media companies can get fined heftily. Do you see a disparity in how social media companies do platform regulation across the two different contexts?
Jabez, thank you for that question. And the way I will respond to it is perhaps, picking up from what my colleagues have said. And it's really to do with the way we see ourselves and what we are willing to protect and to advocate for. So when it comes to regulation, and we look at policies to protect, and we always talk of Africa as if it's one place. It's many different places, many different cultures, many ways of doing and looking at things. But if there was a way in which we could come up with a common standard, like my colleague said, of defending our own rights to democracy, for instance, because you talk of elections, and saying maybe from an African Union level, this is what we are going to put in place, which protects the sanctity of our elections from a social media space. And I know that the AU, through the Malabo Foundation, has been doing something like that and has come up with a blueprint, an AI blueprint from a governance and policy frameworks. And I know that about 7 countries in Africa have already sort of started to develop, policies and frameworks which are being implemented at different levels. But the reality of it is most of Africa has not even got there yet. It's not even at the table where the conversation is taking place. So when it comes to, what we saw with, some of the social upheavals that have taken place and how, social media or big tech has responded, I think probably it has responded to the point of the most pressure. And the pressure is not coming from us as Africans for them to respond in the same way that they've responded in other jurisdictions. So I would really look to ourselves on this one and say we need to be at the forefront of making sure that we're heard and we're at the conversation when it happens.
Great. Thank you for that feedback. Just moving on to you, Asmal, you've done quite a lot of work in laying the groundwork infrastructure. You worked in quite a lot of African contexts, laying down the digital infrastructure. And when it comes to elections, we've seen in the cases where platform self-regulation fails, governments have resulted to things like internet shutdowns, right? So I'll give you the example of Ethiopia, where Facebook, for example, is currently, sorry, Meta's coming up in this conversation so many times, but it's quite used often in the continent. But Meta is being sued by for its role in the Ethiopian crisis. We've already seen quite its precedents in, for example, in the Myanmar example. And we've seen sometimes African governments say, hey, if platforms are not going to regulate, we're going to resort to internet shutdowns as a way of then taking it up upon ourselves. How do you think we should balance between self-regulation, where we allow the media companies to come up with their own laws and policies, and governments wanting to take it upon themselves, which is their responsibility to prevent war crimes from happening and resulting to measures such as internet regulation shutdowns?
For one, I think this is symptomatic of where we are as, I think, human population and like learning this our way through this thing. I mean, for context, it's barely 100 years ago that public speaking became digitalized. The gramophone I think was still in use at the turn of the last century. Saying that to say draconian steps like shutting down is never, of course, right. It's very anti-democratic, and that's just not what Commonwealth does, to make that clear. But also, in a deeper sense, it begs the question exactly, onus is on whom, as was said by the colleagues here. We have one part where I think Meta is quite right. It is a question for civil society or government. The other part of it is indicative of where Africa is right now in terms of digital maturity. And the sad reality is that there's great disparities. We have, for example, Seychelles and Rwanda and Kenya doing really well. And we have other states, some of the global laggards. Overall, I don't think digital literacy and penetration of digital understanding of ethics and these things is very great. And this is reflective in leaders being able to do or take these extreme steps. I think another good example of this draconian action was what was done, I think, in Tanzania a couple years ago in terms of taxing, approach of taxation. However, I'm not very critical in, unless the government is a really bad actor. I don't think they mean badly by doing it. I think they think that the leaders especially thinking that they need to protect something that is important, and at times we don't really agree with it, especially now we see what's happening in terms of increasing polarity globally. Hey, but the reality is that coming back to the African question, what can be done is to educate people. It's a very long arc move. I don't think there's any magic bullet to fix it. It's about looking to the next generation and educating people, encouraging people to take ownership of their situations and their own context, and answering their own questions and posing these things back to the government. To go back a bit to the question in terms of exploitation, I don't know how I feel about it personally, because 25 years ago, I was working at a course in the St. Vincent and Grenadines, and that's where I learned digital tools. I learned to program by doing something for a company I was working in litigation support, which you expose a lot of really bad things to. Many of my colleagues had mental breakdown. I don't think it is exploitative on purpose. I think there's an opportunity there, a competitive advantage that a capitalist system will want to take advantage of. I think, however, the indictment on the supplier for Meta or OpenAI has been a lack of corporate responsibility to ensure that workers are taken care of. And this is something that rests very much within the remit of the people. I think if you look at what happened in Apple's supply chain with the Bangladeshi disaster, it took a tragedy like that for the world to wake up and say, hey, what's going on? But it was really civil society in America who pushed back. Perhaps it's time to look at civil society in Africa, not just a continent, in countries, specific countries, to say, hey, let's not wait for everybody to get going. Let us speak about our own problems here in this very specific sense and tackle them and say, we want your investment. Yes, we actually need this opportunity. There were people who were saying that even this very low minimum rate is actually good for them. They're feeding their families. So the question is, do we take the bread out of people's mouths in the drive for idealistic solution? Or do we accept this is the operational context as of now? It's not where we're going to be forever, but for now we need to have the checks and balances in place that will take the best out of this for the next step.
Great. Thank you for that great comment. Yeah, Chuks, as you mentioned, you prepared. I just want to move to the Nigerian context. And Nigeria, in a way, sometimes sets precedents in how governments react to external entities. So I'll give you an example. Former President Buhari once made a tweet, and Twitter removed his tweet, and then he banned Twitter from Nigeria. Um, and so the question is, with regards to uh, platforms that are not running in the jurisdictions and we can't hold them account, right? In your example, the government decided to take that draconian measure. Nanjala Nyabola asked this interesting question that I'd like to ask to you. What does platform regulation look like when the platform that is appending the political space is being run elsewhere, governed by laws outside your jurisdiction, and ultimately answerable to shareholders in another country apart from your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my thoughts on that would be that one, we've already talked about how we need to make sure that we strengthen our regulatory powers, the laws, and all of that. But I want to emphasize on making sure that for that kind of use case, we make clear and we enforce data sovereignty. So we have, for example, in Nigeria, we have the NDPR, we have the Kenya Data Protection Act, we have lots of these, right? But it's one thing to have it in writing. It's another thing to have clear mechanisms where it's not just a dog, it's a dog with a teeth, right? So when we have data sovereignty there, first of all, then it would enforce that whatever data is being collected on any country, like citizens of any country in Africa, they would, for example, remain in Africa. So when that particular organization knows that they have something at stake, they wouldn't just see countries in Africa as just a farm where they just go and they will see themselves as having a stake in Africa. Then secondly, I know some countries are already doing it, ensuring that these social media platforms are licensed. If they know that they have a license and they will likely lose their license if they act in inimical interests to Africa, they would act differently. Now, of course, we would want to believe that people are altruistic and all, but that's not necessarily the case. So sometimes these laws and policies helps to guide behavior. So having, for example, the licensing in place, making sure that data sovereignty is in place, and also making clear, like having them understand, okay, this is the way things are done. So one of the things that is common for many African countries is sometimes it's unclear, and sometimes they feel like when they lobby, they can get away with certain things. But if they know that there is a consistency in the way this law is going to be applied, then they know that if they take certain steps that is dangerous to the operations within that country, they will get certain repercussions. Then there is no doubt about it, and they will even though they have shareholders outside the continent, they will see African countries as a stakeholder that they want to also make happy, especially if they want to keep the African market.
Sure. Yeah, just thank you for that feedback. And I mean, building upon that, I think Twitter was finally forced to register in Nigeria and have a license. And I just want to bring that conversation to Ida. There's been this sentiment we've had shared across the panel where we're talking about capitalistic incentives, where these companies are driven to maximize shareholder value. My question to you would be, should a platform be allowed to operate in a market if it's not fully prepared to take responsibility for the political consequences it may trigger? So you gave the example of Meta not having access to training for Lingala, right? Should Meta launch in Congo if it knows it doesn't have models that can deal with Lingala content? How do you balance between capitalistic driven incentives, we need to conquer an African market, and are we ready to handle the political consequences of not having tools to deal with Lingala, for example?
It's a great question. Look, I mean, there's a couple of things I disagree with, actually. First, this idea that, and I don't want to take the Twitter example and with the President Buhari, but there seems to be in this conversation this dichotomy of like big tech is bad Africa is being taken advantage of. We're like these, poor babies, like very much victimized. And and that's not the case, right? I think the reality is that it's a bit more nuanced than that, right? Because a lot of the time, a lot of our work in public policy in big tech is actually protecting human rights in the countries that we serve, right? Because one can argue is it was it right or not for Twitter to remove the tweet of President Buhari? But there should be rules around how one conduct themselves in online. And what we found ourselves, especially in the space of social media, is that when the platform launched, and I don't think when Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, he imagined in his vision he would be that big, right? It was in his dorm in Harvard, right? And that's the thing just took off. And so a lot of the time we found ourselves in a space where there's a regulatory vacuum, right? Where we would like to enforce human rights, where people have the right to say what they think, and even President Trump was banned from both Facebook and Twitter, right? Because of the type of speech, right? That he was saying at the time. And a lot of our communities, what we call them community standards. So those are the rules that govern what one can say or not say on the platform. And those we try as much as possible to make sure that they're universal, which is hard when you're running a global platform. We try to make sure as much as possible that they're underpinned by human rights, right? So that people have the freedom of expression, which, to be honest, we don't have in a lot of our countries, right? So if you say something on Facebook, I don't think necessarily the right thing to say, oh, the fact that the Senegalese government can ask Facebook to remove your content or to remove you shows that we have power as African. That's not the type of power we want, right? We want power that really recognize and that's hinged on values that we all as African respect and feel like also advances our own human rights and development. So I think it's important to bring that nuance. And here that I'm saying the critical problem is not so much that the shareholders are in the West. That is true, that the headquarters of many of these companies are in the West. That's true. The main problem is that there's no systematic laws around how do we deal with that type of content. And the EU were the first one to do it. They introduced something that's called a Digital Service Act, where they said, Meta, Google, YouTube, all of you content platforms, these are the ways that we would like you to regulate content, right? That we would like you to have systems of removing content when it's flagged. And the problem with that is that we don't have that in our countries. In our countries, every time you hear someone talk about a fake news bill or a bill against misinformation, it's oftentimes a covered attempt at saying, how do I make sure that I silence all of my opponents, right? And all of the activists in the country. That's the reality of it, right? So I do think that we need to be, even as African, we need to look inside ourselves and really push the values of integrity, especially when it comes to policy making, when it comes to regulation, beyond this relationship of the West between us. So that being said, on your specific context around, we don't have Lingala, should we launch the product? I would say yes, right? Because technology will continue to evolve and we can develop that capacity of Lingala. And I think looking at the narrow aspect of, we don't have all of the tools to mitigate some of the political risk, that negates the fact that there are a lot of businesses that rely on WhatsApp, right? People rely, and a lot of Africa's economy is being more and more powered by the diaspora, and the diaspora use social media and the internet to be able to have access to those tools. So they are useful to our economies, and I do think we should look at the risk assessment and the basically the risk assessment, but also in a way that's quite broad, that's broader than just politics, because it's about the development of the continent as a whole.
Sure. Thank you for reminding us that big tech is not the bad guys. So just moving on to the idea of, we've seen quite a lot of models being released recently, and a big hallmark of this models is to train a basic language model, you need quite high compute infrastructure. And there's this idea, I don't like using this term, but a lot of people use it in Oxford, democratizing AI. And I want to talk about compute infrastructure. I'll give you an example. I'll use Meta because they publicly shared what infrastructure they have. So Meta has a cluster, 24,000 A100 GPUs, right? That's just an example I'll give you. And they train a model with that. my department, I would mention it is what it is, but we have two A100 GPUs. You can see the contrast, even within the Western context, you can see the contrast between compute access in industry and academia. As Econet, coming from Econet, and what do you think, how can we bridge the gap to access to compute infrastructure? Do you think entities like yourself can provide access to compute infrastructure to train models?
Jabez, thank you once again. I believe, yes, we can to an extent. And what I mean by that is if we look at our businesses, we're the largest also fiber carrier in Africa with over 100,000 kilometers of fiber across the continent. And, we talk of Cape to Cairo and that whole vision of connecting Africa in that way. And largely it has been realized. And we're also building a lot of data centers across Africa, and we're looking to be in 25 African cities in the near future. The reality, though, with the level of scale that is required, is that we're not going to be able to do it alone, not as our own organization, not as individual African countries, and even Africa itself. There's going to be a need to collaborate because the resources required are at a scale. I think Meta's statistics, as you've alluded to, are at a scale where, if you look at the kind of the structure of our economies and even the size of our economies relative to the kind of investments that are being made, you're talking about investments that Meta is doing being 2x of your GDP. I won't say how many X of my country's GDP it is, but really that just shows you just how much of a gap that there is in terms of the ability to develop a lot of this compute infrastructure. One thing I will mention though, and I think it's relevant for this kind of an audience, is when you look at the kind of foreign direct investment that's coming into Africa, you compare that maybe to the US and other countries, we are a tiny fraction. So if you look at Africa as a whole, I think it probably matches maybe countries like Singapore in terms of foreign direct investment. Think of how small Singapore is. Think of how big Africa is. That's what you're looking at. But one thing that you have in Africa, which is growing, is remittances into Africa. So the African diaspora is growing. And it's in some ways, when I was looking at the stats in my own country, remittances are 6x of FDI. When I was looking at Africa, I think it's about 2 point something X of FDI. So actually that African diaspora is doing something amazing in terms of how it's deploying resources back to the African continent. The challenge for us, I think, as Africans is how do we turn this from being just social, addressing social needs into maybe building startups and building capacity for Africa to innovate and being able to use this resource not only for consumptive purposes, but to build at scale something that will be quite different. I know it's not talking directly to computational capacity, but we have to start somewhere. And the reality is there is a big gap and we're not going to close it soon. And we need to do something fairly transformative to be able to address the imbalance that is created in terms of capital. And maybe just, to end, when you look at America, for example, in terms of foreign direct investment, if my numbers are correct, they were, is it maybe between 10 and 12 trillion compared to Africa, which was looking at maybe 400 billion.
Yeah.
So the gap is just so massive.
Gotcha.
And we've got a lot of work to do. But we can collaborate. And the technology that has come from the likes of Meta and other companies has allowed us to leapfrog in terms of development and has allowed, as Ade said, in terms of our ability to use these benefits for business, for societal benefits. And I think, there is a lot that we can learn and collaborate.
Sure. Thank you for that robust engagement. I just wonder, Osmal, just to quickly, I want to engage on that, just to build upon that. Osmal, you've worked a lot quite on the infrastructure side, and I wonder whether Africa has a potential to use its green energy to bridge the gap when it comes to AI model development. We've seen the environmental impacts of training large models and what it does in Europe. Can we leverage our green energy to try and close the gap in terms of deploying energy efficient data centers or GPU clusters?
Yes and no. To be honest, that ship has sailed in many ways. I'll speak directly to some of my own experiences. I am a program manager for two work streams in the Commonwealth AI Consortium. One of them happens to be capacity building, and the next one is data infrastructure. That audacious goal that we have had for a while is to see if we can have one of these wonderful members of the consortium that I won't mention, but some very massive companies are there, donate as charity computational power, either as cloud credits or a physical AI machine to a country. And the answer has been consistently and resoundingly no. And that's because this is very much the holy grail of the new world. That same very long paper that you sent, which I'm still going through, I never really had a look at the the US's act against China to ban imports, and I had a detailed read of it on the train. It basically has put up such stringent controls on trading with China that it's very much acting in a way that is arguably anti-Chinese and pro-American. But deeper to that, it is not very altruistic overall. I'm saying that to say the Americans have done it in such a way that protects themselves and their vested interests. I think, frankly speaking, this is what Africa and African countries need to do. And okay, we can't get computational capacity back. What can we get back? Most of the rare earths in the world, like outside of China, are in Africa. A single country, we all know which country it is. That is one of the most exploited countries in the world. There should be controls to protect that fundamental global future resource. The price of copper is going gangbusters because of the import of copper in the green industry. We know exactly where a lot of copper comes from. Yeah. And the same, this can go on and on and on and on and on. When I said earlier Africa is the richest continent in the world, I didn't just mean capital riches, I meant resource riches and human capacity riches, and that's the other part of it. So whilst we won't be able to get back, let's say, get ahead of this race for the most petaflops or whatever it is now, we can definitely get ahead in terms of the literacy race, in terms of the basically cornering the key parts of the market that we still have there, and give it time. This is not, as I said, a silver bullet. It's going to take time. Building infrastructure, building roads, building bridges, it takes time. Building digital infrastructure is going to take decades. Yeah. This is a reality, but this just need to know what we can do and do that, and be very, frankly, very determined and coldly prejudiced about protecting what is ours.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Chooks, moving on to you, you helped draft the Nigeria AI policy, and I just want to shift this conversation to AI policy. There have been sentiments around the continent that we're having what people are terming as premature regulation, that you only regulate an ecosystem that's already thriving. I'll give you the example of mobile money. M-Pesa fast came, the technology was launched, and then regulation played catch up to match the technology. How do we balance between regulation and leaving the environment open for innovation? Quick sentiments on that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So what you would observe generally is regulation in the global space always seems to play catch up to technology. And while it makes sense for us to say, oh, let's give the space for innovation and then we regulate, right size regulation, there's the risk that if we do that, then we'll have a situation where we begin to suffer the consequences of unregulated tech before the technology is, we have a proper framework in place. Now, the sentiment, for example, let me just take us a bit out, the US market and the EU. On the US side, you have tech running at full steam, and then regulations are just like based on different jurisdictions. On the EU side, you have all kinds. You have the EU AI Act, you have the GDPR, and the US is like, oh, EU is not making as much progress because of. But when you come into the EU, there's a place of, oh, you feel a sense of safety. Now, for the Nigerian AI policy, the understanding is it wasn't drafted in isolation. It was drafted with captains of industry informed. So it wasn't just written with no idea or just unnecessarily stifling. It was written with a sense of this is what is possible. This is the kind of innovation gap we need to hold. And there is the policy, and the strategy document is currently being produced, which is supposed to make sure that the policy as it is written can hit the ground running. So we don't have a situation where when it is enacted as an act of law, it now becomes, it makes doing business in Nigeria even more difficult. So to cut long story short, the understanding that we got was we wanted to make sure that we don't have regulation playing catch up with technology.
Great.
and people suffer the consequences of unregulated
Sure.
technology.
Thank you. We'll quickly, just before we move on to the audience engagement, kindly please can Slido and share your questions. We can already see questions coming up. But just to wrap up this part of the conversation, Ida, I have a question for you. You've worked quite a lot in policy and you've formulated different policies, and every policy fits its context, right? And so my question to you would be, we've seen notions of fairness, equality, justice are quite different across different places. To what extent do you think African values should shape AI policy? And I'm asking with regards to policies such as Ubuntu philosophy, where a lot of African communities, it's not that we disregard the individual person, but we see the individual person through the lens of a community. And that's quite a different notion of individual or fairness in the Western context. To what extent can should African values be engaged in this policy? And can we provide a template for the world to follow?
That's a great question, by the way. And the answer is absolutely, right? I think AI policy is quite nascent, to be honest. Even the EU has the EU AI Act, but that was just voted earlier this year and has yet to be implemented. And in a lot of part of the world, people are looking more at soft policy rather than hard regulation, just because the technology is so nascent. So I do think this is really the moment for Africa to enter the stage and to really help build those global standards. Because at the end of the day, these technologies are not just going to be Africans, they're going to be global, right? People are going to use them all over the world. And I do think we should also dare to hope as Africans that the technology we produce and the solutions we produce shape the world, right? That it's from Africa to the world. And I think and absolutely, I think African values should underpin policy making. I think now the bigger question is how and what does that look like? And I do think for that to happen, we need that idea of collective bargaining power, right? That is just not one individual African country speaking for itself, but really us coming together as a continent. The tragedy of it is that the AU is not built like the EU, right? So it's not a binding, a separate national institutions where when the EU puts together a law, like all the EU countries have to follow it. But I do think it's something really for us maybe to start thinking about those African values and how we implement them first in our continent, and then how do we bring it forward to the rest of the world.
Great. So we'll quickly jump into the audience. We're going to try and get 2 questions. I'll ask Chishi. If you have any questions, just quickly raise your hand and I'll take note of that. But also I'll engage the Slido questions. But moving... Okay, perfect. I have a question on Slido. Last question would be, there's this whole conversation of AGI, and we can't have an AI conversation and not talk about AGI. So it seems like every tech company is aiming towards building this artificial general intelligence that will solve all humankind problems. And we've seen quite a lot of this ideas being driven by, sorry to frame it, but white rich male billionaires who are leaving, it seems like their childhood ideas. So if you look at the ideas of transhumanism, for example, of us getting into this embodied agents, for example, to what extent, do you think we should be building AGI in the first place? And what is Africa's role in like deciding its future? Anyone wants to take that up? Oh, perfect. Chicks.
Okay, so I'll be building on what Ida said. We need to impute our values. So first of all, the way AI will be implemented in Africa, and I'm not saying Africa as one country because I know it's a lot of cultures, but for the sake of this statement, permit me to use Africa as one country, as one continent. So the way to be done within an African context will be very different from the Western context. One, like we've mentioned, Ubuntu. So while everyone is talking about transhumanism, right, with Africa in the loop, will bring a sense of balance to that view. So yes, I guess I'm biased because I'm a practitioner of AI. I believe that with AGI in, with the right values, Western and African, we'll be able to have something that will work for everyone. So when it comes to transhumanism, instead of just focusing on the individual independently, we are focusing on an AI that cares about the social development of the weakest of us, that cares about community development, rather than just thinking about things like, oh, how do we do an AGI that can plan for the future? We are thinking of an AGI that can solve pressing problems: healthcare, precision agriculture, education, an AGI that cannot be used to create political instability, or there are controls in place that can prevent that. So I feel if we put that in the mix, while everybody else, or they are thinking about their play dream, we will have a sense of grounding, bringing in our African values.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, so we'll quickly go on to the audience questions. Thanks for everyone who's sent quite a lot of questions. Starting with you, Roy. Someone who's, based on your experience on Econet providing internet services in Zimbabwe, I've quite had a lot of my Zim friends complaining about the cost of internet in Zimbabwe. Question to you is, how can we utilize AI to assist residents in poor and rural areas, considering that AI often requires high internet speed and better hardware? Quick thoughts on that?
I think the rails are improving over time, and what you see about connectivity, even when you look at the cost and how connectivity is delivered, there are new models coming up all the time, and you asked me to talk from my experience. So part of what we're doing with some of the infrastructure is to introduce what we call diet base stations. So these are not connected to the grid, they're solar powered, and some of them are pretty small. They've got a range of maybe 5 kilometers in terms of where you get coverage, but they are small, deliberately low cost, easy to operate, and making it cheaper to deliver the service. So when it comes to rural areas, what you also don't need is, you don't need the high speeds. At 5 megabits per second, you can deliver a service that works on most applications. And then what we're also doing is, smartphones are a problem in Africa. So getting access to a reliable, cheap smartphone, so access to devices. So we're able to deliver things like ChatGPT on what we call USSD, which is basically SMS-based technology, which is what was actually the backbone of mobile money services. It wasn't apps, it was largely SMS-based services, which are cheap, easy to and effective to operate. So the models that are coming up, I think, allow us to change the paradigm of accessibility. And when it comes to cost, if you say the cost of data is expensive, we can deliver that, the language models over SMS if need be. And I think with improving access to power through solar power, I think solar is really getting a revolution, because I've heard about how the price of panels has come down quite exponentially over the last few years, and the ability for data and power storage. So I think there are new paradigms in technology that will reshape that particular conversation, and I think that is actually happening as we speak.
Thank you for that. Ida, just moving on to you, there's a question here on Meta. What is Meta doing to ensure African voices are respected, considering the digital divide and limited digital literacy across Africa? Any quick comments on that?
Yeah, quick one. I mean, I guess the question is in the context of content, right? I mean, there are many policies and programs we've put in place for that. So first, we have a team that is responsible from what we call our content policy. So that team, every time we develop a new policy, whether it's around how do we think about hate speech, how do we think about nudity, how do you think about AI-generated content, we make sure that we have consultation within Africa with representatives of the civil society. Some of you may have heard that Meta also put together something we call an oversight board. And so this is a sort of accountability board we put together, where every time Meta take a decision around a specific piece of content, whether it's in your specific country, in your specific jurisdiction you disagree with, you go to that board and actually appeal that content, the decision that Meta takes. And the board is made up of Africans and world leaders all across the world who will review it. So just to say that this is feedback the company has heard for many years, and we've worked continuously to improve.
Great. Thank you for that. Osmo, moving on to you. There are two questions you had quickly combined based on your experience in digital upskilling within the continent. What ideas do you have in making technology more accessible, putting laptops in classroom and closing the digital gap? And with regards to that, do you think how should industries transform how practical education is delivered in our learning institutions? Should that change?
Two good questions. Actually, very much in line with what has been happening recently. At the just concluded education ministers meeting in London. The cadence and delivery of education systems is under question because this classroom setting is played out to younger minds. And sorry if we're boring you, but this is the reality. So people are requiring more immersive learning and everything like that. And this again goes back to the first thing I said. This transformational opportunity means that we have a clean slate. I like the point about mobile connectivity needing to increase in Africa. I go back to some traditional metrics. I think you were the one that asked, someone asked about metrics earlier. We have, of course, we think about internet penetration. And if you look at a place like Tanzania, we say internet penetration in Tanzania is relatively low. If you look at mobile penetration, it's extremely high. And this is very much the case across the continent. Yes, traditional infrastructure is not there, but newer technologies, it's now still not up to par with the rest of the world, but it's rapidly increasing. I think this is a platform upon which you can deliver these things. And again, step back and think, just like what I said about policy, what is education in the context of the country or the situation that we're speaking about? I mean, frankly speaking, from the Caribbean, I know our education system is heavily influenced by colonial forces. To the 21st century, still very much is. And it's really sad for me as a Vincentian to be able to go to Malawi and understand their curriculum because it's the same colonial system. It's not fit for purpose. So we need to step back and think about what is relevant as per the context of the country we're in, and then shape the digital tools and the platforms we're using to meet that end. And again, constantly innovate as we go along.
Perfect, great. Chucks, moving on to you before I don't know if we have any audience questions. Chichi, just one question. Do we have time for audience question? Just one. Okay, get me one person, one question. That's up to you so that I don't get bitten afterwards. But moving on to you, Chucks. There's someone who's asking, what should we focus on? Should we focus on using ChatGPT and using these tools, or should we focus on building our own what part should we play in the AI revolution? And the reason I ask you this question is because I know Nigeria announced some funds to build its own large language model. So where should the focus be?
Okay, so every AI is as good as the data it is trained on. So we can build chatbots if we want to, but it would not make sense in an African context if it's not trained on African data. If we just do lift and shift, then what will just end up happening is you have increase in bias. You're not able to recognize our customs, our values, and it will just be entirely out of place. So I think the focus should be ensuring that we are collecting data responsibly, ensuring that in line with our values, we have some kind of system where there is a sense of community ownership, and making sure that if, for example, data is collected from a community, there should be a way that the community can benefit from that data. So if, for example, an AI solution, which is a derived data model, is done, then perhaps if that AI solution is going to be commercialized, that community or those communities whose data have been used with that model gets that solution at maybe a subsidized rate, something like that. So rather than not spending time trying to just carry a chatbot, which I don't have anything against, it's good, we should focus on ensuring that we are delivering, we are collecting the data that represent the context in Africa, and we have more than enough of it so that the AI can just fit in within the African society.
Great, great. Thanks for that feedback. Over where is a question? Great. Tell us your name. Quick question. I hope it's a question, not a comment.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Oliver Davis from Kenya. My question is regarding the AI governance. Recently, I think in March, EU Parliament has been held for passing the AI governance law. It's held all over as a landmark. Now we know how EU with the GDPR are very strict, and the punitive measures they put in place for those who disregard the law, and it's being adhered to across Europe and including UK, who has adopted it as a DPA. Now for Africa, a month later in April, presented the white paper on AI. Now my question is, what we know about Africa, some laws are normally passed, enacted, but to implement is another story. Is Africa ready for the AI governance law? Thank you.
Quick comment on that. Anyone wants to quickly take it?
I suppose I can say whether or not Africa is ready, it's going to happen. But the deeper thing is quite right. I think my colleague mentioned the need for teeth to these laws. And I think that is what is needed. It applies right across the board. Many countries do have on paper the laws and the regulations that guides these things. AI regulation, I have no question, will come like right across the continent also. What we need is probably a non-statutory governance body or some committee to ensure that things are like respected and implemented as per the letter. And I think this is a question, and I think it's a deeper one. But to answer the question, Africa is not ready, but it has to be ready. And the only way you get ready is by getting started.
Perfect. Last question, Modo, keep it. I don't think it's working.
Okay. Yeah, so Microsoft, G42, $1 billion in Kenya, data centers, cloud. How do we replicate that across the continent? Thank you.
Great question. Microsoft just announced $1 billion for a data center. How do we replicate that?
No, I mean, you can. I can.
Hot potato.
What I was just about to say is we just need to get more big foreign companies to do that across the board, right?
Can Meta announce something right now? Joking. We want to wrap up this conversation, and you've been quite a great audience. Thank you for chiming in, listening. And I just want to get your quick feedback. Keep it 30 seconds. What is something that you would want to envision for AI? Is it the data side, the model side, policy side? What is something we can all take away with as we leave? Starting with you, Roy.
I won't go all technical, and I'll say, as a lover of science fiction, one thing that I've seen is our ability to dream things. And I was just remembering there's a book I read which was turned into a movie called I, Robot, which was written by Isaac Asimov. And he started talking about robotics in the 1940s, long before we could conceptualize what we are seeing now. So when you ask me what I see in the future, I think I'm looking at over my lifetime just to see the kind of things that we can dream about now, which maybe in our minds we can't conceive it yet. But at the end of our lives, we will see that, the things that we thought were pure fiction actually come into reality. So in saying this, all I'm saying is, as someone who loves science fiction, I'm just looking at, someone like Jules Verne imagining 20,000 leagues under the sea, and what the 20,000 leagues under the sea look like in our lifetime. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to AI and technology in the continent in general, my line is that it's time for Africa to be open for business, and I mean truly open for business. And what that means for me is, one, we should just look around our collective bargaining power and stop speaking as individual countries and really leverage this idea of African beyond rhetoric to actually bring it into the table. Second, by 2050, 1/4 of the world population will be African. We don't want to be cold at the table. We want to make sure that we are in a position where there can't be a meeting without us, right? If you're calling to be invited, it means that you're not powerful enough. Like, they cannot have the meeting without you. And for that, we really need to start thinking about our competitive advantage. What can we bring to the world? And I think in the case of AI, talent is going to be key, right? And we have the people. It's time to invest in education and really making sure that the next AI scientists and researchers are African.
Wow, great, powerful. Next, Osman.
I think on the back of that is really hope. I mean, it's the democratization of access to tools that otherwise would be beyond the remit of most people. And youth engagement, it's, I think, second to none, like in Africa. And it's right across the world, but especially in Africa, there is this deep appreciation and need and ownership of the things that are uniquely identifiable as African challenges. And this combined with those tools gives us our opportunity. So I think it's very realistic to say that this dream, this idea will be realized by the end of the century, if not sooner. And it's we need to balance governance and not stifle innovation. But the thing is probably just hope, just because of the buy-in that we're seeing.
Great. Chooks, any last sentiments?
Yes. I won't echo what everyone has said, but I would just, a different perspective would be for the entrepreneurs of Africa. entrepreneurs in Africa, my vision is a future where we have more and more Africa-inspired solutions, more and more solutions that address the immediate needs, less and less of solutions that are reflecting what is prevalent in the Western world, like more e-commerce, which is great, but more and more solutions that take AI down to the grassroots. Precision agriculture, farming, healthcare, telemedicine, logistics, transportation. There's so much. A future where we have more and more of those Africa-specific solutions that will make Africa a force, and we are at the table because they want to get how did we do this so that we can replicate it in the Western world.
Great. That was such a great place to leave the conversation. And thank you for pointing a picture of hope that even despite the fact that we've talked about the different problems, it's still the future still looks quite bright. It's been great having all of you guys. Thank you so much, Roy, for taking your time. Thank you, Ida. Thank you, Osmal. And thank you, Chucks. Let's give them a round of applause.